Thanks, Anne. I just got handed a schedule, so I don't want to read from that, because it keeps changing every day. I'm so exhausted from being called a white liberal racked with guilt that it's kind of nice for a moment to be on the Upper West Side, which I assume is still filled with white liberals racked with guilt. I'm going to take my coat off, actually. I'm going to read a little from the book, and then I want to have as many questions as you want to ask, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I think try to make sure it makes as much sense as possible. This is the prologue. If you stand before a towering oak tree and look closely, you will see the roiling story of race in America woven deep into the bark and branches of the tree itself. A long, twisting, looping story made up of many strands, all disparate, all finally, crucially connected. Race is a subject about which there are points of agreement and about which there is no agreement. A subject that is either spoken of reluctantly or not spoken of at all. Race is used by all of us in the most manipulative ways, is often force-fit and reduced to something it isn't, to something that gives us a sense of comfort, a false one. Many of us thought, needed to feel, the whole business was settled. But it's not, never has been. Laws have only taken us so far. Much as we might try from under the powerful and permissive umbrella of democracy to deny it, run from it, not think about it, act cynical about it, and even try to wish it away, there race remains. This malignancy, this great Achilles heel of our nation's future, cornering us, dividing us, and exhausting us. There it remains, visible and invisible, mainly separate and unequal, patiently waiting for the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln once said, to take permanent root and work toward common ground and common good. Race, as I've learned without enthusiasm, is incorrigible, defies a writer's natural, cozy desire to order things, to have a tidy beginning, middle, and end. However grudgingly, I accepted that fact long ago. I accepted it because as long as race and all the tentacles that attach to it continues to be America's greatest burden and greatest dilemma, as long as we continue to argue over what truths we truly hold to be self-evident, as long as roughly 3/5 of whites continue to think of blacks as both intellectually inferior and lazy, as long as our ghettos continue to deteriorate and vast numbers of people are not connected to work of any kind, as long as 11-year-old girls like Jessica Bradford, living not far and yet so far from the White House, are busily planning their own funerals, as she was in 1993, instead of their next birthday parties, there can be no satisfying conclusion, none at all. As we move unsteadily toward a new century, the dialogue on race relations in America, one that is honest, that punches through easy rhetoric and political expediency, and that leads to solutions which just might last, must continue. It must continue because so much about the way we live is at stake. Chapter 1. So this was how it began, this journey through a labyrinth. It was a Sunday, the first Sunday of November in 1989, and I was in Montgomery, Alabama, studying faces. The reassuring sounds of amen and yes punctuating the Indian summer air. It was a day devoted to remembering those who had given their lives in the hard battle for civil rights. Some of the faces were familiar to me, and some were not. Rosa Parks had come home to Montgomery from Michigan, a small figure who, by refusing in 1955 to give up her seat on a bus, had, it turned out, taken a large step and launched a movement. Mamie Till, mother of Emmett, was still recognizable from the photographs all those years before in Jet magazine, especially the one of her teenage son in an open casket, the photograph she was determined the world should see and not forget. Myrlie Evers, widow of Medgar, had come from Los Angeles, never dreaming that 4 years later she would have her measure of justice. Chris McNair had come from Birmingham, recalling a different Sunday, the Sunday his daughter Denise, 11 years old, and 3 other little girls were blown to bits at the 16th Street Baptist Church. Until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Those words, spoken by Martin Luther King Jr. and taken from the Bible, were inscribed on the black granite wall that was part of the Civil Rights Memorial, the dedication of which was the reason that 5,000 people had come. But there was something wrong with this picture of harmony, of black and white together. It should have been a satisfying picture. It represented, after all, much of what King had pushed for, and in many respects it was. Along with the historic legislation of the 1960s, the black middle class continued to grow in number. There were 4 times as many black families with incomes above $50,000 than in 1964. Continued to symbolize the group who had benefited the most from the movement and the social programs of that era, the group who was exerting its influence in all aspects of American life. And yet, in 1989, despite its various accomplishments, the black middle class was nearly as isolated, either by choice or circumstance, as those who continued to live in the inner cities, where conditions were getting worse, not better. And it was impossible to escape the fact that too much unsavory stuff was still going on. Howard Beach and Bensonhurst had become the new places of reference. Nearly every college campus, it seemed, had an incident to report or to hide. Speaker after speaker remarked on how important it was to have this memorial, how important it was that people not forget, how important it was that one's children and grandchildren learn about the struggle for the first time. But speaker after speaker also remarked on how the decade that was coming to a close had threatened to undo so much of what so many had worked so hard to achieve. Turning back the clock was a phrase one heard often to describe the Reagan administration's stance on civil rights. And when the great communicator himself spoke of welfare queens, well then that made it okay, acceptable even, to actively voice all the racism and prejudice and anger that hadn't been put to rest anyway. As the words to "We Shall Overcome" reverberated up and down Washington Avenue, to the White House of the Confederacy, where the ghost of Jefferson Davis was still in residence, to the state capitol, where the march from Selma ended and the Confederate flag was still defiantly aloft, and around the corner to the Baptist Church on Dexter Avenue, the church where King had been pastor. The song had not lost 1 ounce of its power to stir deeply, to make all things seem possible. Everybody was singing, swaying from Try that again. Everybody was singing, swaying from side to side, joining hands, locking arms. Seeing Martin Luther King III standing near Ethel Kennedy took me back to 1968, to the assassinations of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy 2 months apart, to the profound sense of loss. And yet it also took me back to something else, something that occurred 1 month before King was cut down in Memphis, the stark warning from the Kerner Commission that America was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The prime culprit, a summary of the Commission's report concluded, was white racism, for not only creating the ghettos, but perpetuating their existence. I had come to Montgomery to remember those who had died and to honor the struggle, a struggle that had a rhythm and a rightness to it that was all its own. But I left Montgomery with a different purpose, with a focus on the present, on trying to determine how far the country had come since the days of the Civil Rights Movement and how far we had or wanted to go. In order to do that, I eventually realized, in order to explore race in America today through the looking glass of one place, I couldn't choose a place like Birmingham or Selma or Montgomery. I couldn't choose them because they were places forever frozen in our memory. The very mention of their names bringing forth images of children being flattened by hoses, of marchers being driven back and beaten down on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, of freedom riders being ambushed and viciously struck as they descended from buses. The South was permanently tied to the history of the movement. There was no getting around that. Both for that reason and because the Kerner Commission had come about as a result of the 1967 riots in a number of northern cities, I would have to find the story elsewhere. And that elsewhere became Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for a variety of reasons, one of which was that in 1990, an alderman named Michael McGee, with an office in City Hall, had decided to revive the Black Panther Party in Milwaukee and cast a threat over the city that if a certain amount of money, a certain number of programs and various things weren't directed to the inner cities, to the inner city of Milwaukee by 1995, there was going to be urban guerrilla warfare in the streets. That caught my attention, along with the attention of people from as far away as Australia. And a report came out that said that Milwaukee was one of the most segregated cities in America, so segregated, and I think this is a term that could only come about in the 1990s, that it's now called hyper-segregated. And so I decided to go out and take a look to see whether Milwaukee felt like America, whether it could stand as a microcosm, whether it could hold up to be a place that if you read about it here in New York City, it's not so important that it's about Milwaukee, but the people you meet in the book are people that could be you. I'm going to read just a little bit more and then engage all of you in a dialogue. One of the Michael McGee's patron, so to speak, is a very interesting character named Gerald Jones, who's the owner of a black radio station in Milwaukee named WNOV. He also owns a black newspaper and a lot of real estate, and he's always been very well off. But that has not prevented him from continuing to give back and work for the betterment of people in the inner city. So I want to read a chapter in which we get together on a particular Saturday. Have a good weekend and stay off the homicide rate, was the sign-off from Matthew Skelly on WNOV as I came by the station to pick up Gerald Jones. It was Saturday, June 1st, and even though Jones seemed to work all the time or be engaged in high-powered games of chess, he had offered to drive around the inner city with me, show me the sights, as it were, and pick up Michael McGee along the way. We stopped by the headquarters of the Black Panther Militia at 2636 King Drive, and Jones went up to the door. The building was painted red, black, and green, and had a small lawn and flower bed in front, and a sign that read, "Fighting evil is obedience to God, the original order." Inside, on the wall, were posters of Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and other black leaders. Jones stood there for a minute or two, then came back to the car. "He's in there," Jones said, but he probably just doesn't feel like coming to the door. I was prepared for this from my first go-round and didn't mind in the least. In fact, I had some concern about McGee giving me some sort of orchestrated grand tour of urban decay and misery. I was already finding that on my own. On the other hand, Jones's offer hadn't troubled me. It seemed an opportunity to see things through his eyes as well as my own, without feeling hotboxed or blithely nodding agreement or understanding to things that I would doubtless need much more time to reflect on. In any case, McGee had been busy since last I saw him and probably needed his rest. In the middle of May, during a Good Morning America broadcast from Milwaukee, he began blowing whistles and was arrested. He had been in Atlanta on Tony Brown's Journal. He had been in Detroit. He had been in Dallas, and he was about to do Geraldo. Normally, on Saturday mornings, he went fishing early and then played basketball. Today, as it turned out, he had gone to the dentist, was in a certain degree of pain, and just didn't feel like coming to the door. Jones, meanwhile, seemed buoyant. He had a large new tower going up for the station and was of the opinion that his business had boomed since McGee formed the militia. Mike takes the bad guy role off everybody, he had told me the day before. Now we can act normal because we've got a lunatic running loose. Nobody's so hard about the Courier being a far-left paper. Mike makes it seem like the good book now. There was a white-owned car dealership, for instance, that had never run ads in the city's 3 black newspapers before, but had recently bought some space. Jones saw it as a sign that the white community was taking McGee's threats seriously, as was the middle-class black community, mainly in the form of anonymous donations. You can't get a check from a black guy with his name on it. As for the city, Jones felt they had responded too. Buildings that had been shown to the media, especially to 60 Minutes, as examples of the deterioration in living conditions that McGee was talking about, had either been raised or made to look, Jones exaggerated, as if they came out of House and Garden. Actually, he joked, it was getting pretty difficult to find good footage anymore. The city might want to say, and was saying, that this work had long been planned and had nothing to do with McGee, but the timing of some announced efforts certainly gave the impression that it was more than coincidence, and the Greater Milwaukee Committee formed an inner-city task force right after the 60 Minutes broadcast in December. I think by 1995, Jones said, as pessimistic as Mike talks, the city will have answered every one of his demands. And what if that was not the case? If the racial parity he was seeking was not realized? Then he had to go through with his threat, Jones said. If he wasn't serious before, I think he has to be serious now. That's the whole problem. Now he's got too many people involved. White folks. White folks in all black neighborhoods and the reason blacks figured they were there. That was one of many things Gerald Jones wanted to instruct me about as we drove around that day. When a white person comes into a black person's house, it's either to collect a bill or serve notice. That's why there was trouble with the census, he said, referring to the recent report that the 1990 census had been undercounted, primarily in urban areas, but that nothing was likely to be done about it. While I had gotten used to Jones's exaggerating to make a point, I had not quite adjusted to the very contradiction he seemed to represent. A black millionaire who had not turned his back on the very considerable problems that surrounded him every day he came to work. When I told him about the contents of the Alexander's refrigerator and that they were living meal to meal, he said they were among the lucky ones. They were at least working, and that the people McGee was talking about were eating oatmeal in the morning, cornmeal in the afternoon, and a mission meal at night. People that never work, grown men that have never held a job, period. Jones was doing the driving. That was the one string he had attached to his offer of taking me around. Said it would make him feel more comfortable, and it would allow me to concentrate better. This is the blood bank, he said. We were at the corner of 22nd and North. 3 other blood plasma centers were a minute away. Men were lined up, dozens of them, to give blood in exchange for $10. They were only supposed to do it twice a week, but nobody enforced the rule. Consequently, they would go from place to place, becoming more and more dizzy, taking their earnings and often disappearing into stores for beer and other spirits. You know what they used the blood for, Jones said. I said that I didn't. Cosmetics. He said that if we pulled up and attempted to talk to any of them, They would act differently than they would if Jones were not with me. Why was that, I asked. Because white people represent authority to black people. You've got to remember that everybody in authority that black people meet is white. Jones kept on, wanting me to understand that a black person's language with a white person would be different than his language to another black. Take the word motherfucker, he said. You have to listen to the expression in his voice. I can pull up to this guy right now, right here, and I'll tell him, you know, you're a funky motherfucker, and he'll say, thank you, brother. But if he said to you, you're a motherfucker, that means you're full of shit. It's very subtle. But more than shades of language, more than acting differently, more than assumptions about why a white person would show up at a black person's door, Jones wanted to make sure that I was seeing who was in front of me, that I wasn't looking past and through these people. Ralph Ellison had taken this notion of blacks as invisible to white eyes and transformed it into an enduring crucible. But as far as Jones was concerned, that was a book that came out 40 years earlier, and the same stuff kept happening anyway. We drove on, down Walnut Street, into what was once called Bronzeville in the 1940s, where the sounds of Count Basie and Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway and Gatormouth Moore and Earl Father Hines could be heard long into the night by both blacks and whites at places like Arts and the Moonglow and the Flame and the Clef Club. We drove past the 16-room house where Jones had grown up, where the trees used to meet in the middle of the street, an area that he both found difficult to describe and difficult to talk about. Past the Black Holocaust Museum, past so many places that no longer matched his sweet memories of them. His father had had the first black-owned movie theater in Milwaukee, the Century, and he recalled that they, father and son, had been the first blacks in the projection union. I showed the 10 Commandments so many times I could repeat that goddamn thing verbatim. And that his father also had a grocery store. And then, as quickly as we seemed to descend into the past, we came out of it, back into the present, passing all the makeshift stalls where bartering had become the new economy, where everything seemed loose and fluid and tentative, nothing permanent, where the blood bank was still doing a booming business. You know, Jones said, after we'd bought some food at Speed Queen and brought it back to his office, the only thing that we're equal about is the amount of time we get in a day. And for a long time, that one equal thing was taken away by white folk. So if we had 24 hours in a day, 18 of mine belonged to you. He said all this, as he said most things, with panache and without bitterness. The issue of slavery, of being owned, would always be there in some form or another, and would always distinguish the relationship between blacks and whites, would always mark it apart from that between whites and Asians or whites and Hispanics, or between whites and any ethnic group that had emigrated to America and faced adversity. That is not to downplay or minimize the considerable animosity and prejudice those groups encountered, but adversity and being owned are not the same thing. Jones had told me that we needed to be back by 3, but he hadn't told me why. Until now. There was this white woman, an artist, whom Jones and his wife had known for about 25 years and who had cancer and was taking morphine and simply couldn't get around. Jones had known her mother and father, and all 3 of them, when Jones first met them, couldn't stand black people. But their relationship evolved, and the woman's parents died, and now Jones and his wife represented the only family she's got left. And they took care of her, taking her to the hospital, shopping for her, cooking for her, basically making sure that all her needs were met. This woman could never, even in her wildest dreams, ever have thought that one day black people would have to take care of her. She is going to die in the next couple months. We've got to bury her. She's left everything she has to us, you know, every kind of thing. It's crazy, but it teaches you a very valuable lesson. You never know who it is you're going to have to depend on in the long run. You've got to watch how you treat people and what you say to people. I mean, Coleman, you might be the person that ends up saving my life. Last section. She had been nervous about my coming all day, and it showed. As soon as I came up the steps of her brick colonial on North Lake Drive, Blair Moreland peppered me with questions. Was I sure I needed to talk with her? Could I send her a copy of the tape of the interview? At 37, she was at a pivotal juncture. Increasingly discontent with the homogeneity, the whiteness of her life. She said she had just had the most transforming experience, coming to realize the privileges I have as a white person. She was, I feared, going to take me into the world of encounter group speak, and it made me anxious. As anxious as she was, that I was sitting on her front porch and asking her to talk about things and thoughts she had always kept private and was in the early stages of sorting out. Nonetheless, she was right to identify me as a catalyst, and as it turned out, I was glad I stayed. For more than 3 months, she had participated in a workshop called Beyond Racism, and among the many privileges she now realized she had that she had never been conscious of before was the ability, subtle as it might seem, to drive up to an intersection and not have to worry about somebody putting the locks down on their cars. And as in an earlier passage, which I haven't read, on my very first day in Milwaukee, driving to the Milwaukee Urban League, to the first traffic light I got to at King Drive, I put down the lock on my door. And I'm sure it's something I've done many times, but now I was conscious that I was in Milwaukee and I was doing this book, and I noticed that I had done that, and I said, I've just put the lock down on my door. And I said to myself, if you don't later write that you put the lock down on your door, you have no business writing this book, because you're in this book as a first-person narrator. I'd already made that decision. And if I didn't tell you that, I wouldn't be somebody that you really should be embarking on this journey with. So the paragraph I write next is, I smiled tightly when she said that, but didn't say why. I let her go on. Blacks see that all the time, she said. Even middle-class blacks in neighborhoods like this will notice or hear the locks go down. Her awareness of these privileges had come from an essay called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. It was used in an exercise in the workshop, an exercise in which whites formed an inner circle, their backs to an outer circle of mainly blacks and other minorities, and then proceeded to learn about an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks that they could count on cashing in each day. Among the 44 unearned assets McIntosh claims whites possess and blacks for the most part do not are the ability to go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. Use checks, credit cards, or cash without skin color working against the appearance of financial reliability. Feel certain that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. Swear or dress in second-hand clothes or not answer letters without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my race. Do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. Easily buy posters, postcards, picture books, greeting cards, dolls, toys, and children's magazines featuring people of my race. Choose public accommodation without fearing the people of my race cannot get in or will be mistreated in the places I have chosen. If these things are true, McIntosh wrote, this is not such a free country. One's life is not what one makes it. Many doors open for certain people through no virtues of their own. Whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative and average, and also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work which will allow them to be more like us. It was in part this kind of thinking that propelled many, many whites to participate in the civil rights movement. And yet it was and is also this kind of thinking, along with these kind of unearned privileges, that has justifiably called the whole process, the successes as well as the failures of integration, of assimilation into the mainstream, into question. We as whites can talk all we want about how the civil rights movement opened doors for blacks and made it possible for a significant middle class to emerge. But it is a disingenuous argument, hollow at its core. It is disingenuous because for all the arguments we make about reverse discrimination, we haven't really yielded all that much. Nearly 80% of white Americans said in 1995 they were opposed to affirmative action. but only 7% could honestly say they had been the victims of it. We're still in charge. We still call the shots. Things do come our way, are granted to us because we are white. We can't pretend whiteness isn't an identity, that we are somehow invisible, that only blacks stand out or are not seen depending on how you choose to focus your lens. So when you get down to it, Catch-22 still applies. You can do anything you want to do in this country, but just check with us. A good portion of white guilt comes from knowing we have this power and privilege, or knowing but denying we have it, or convincing ourselves that even if we have it, we have never knowingly abused it. For Blair Moreland in particular, that guilt centered around a black woman named Alice Lester, a woman who had worked for her family in Chicago for many years, a woman who had a large role in raising her, in looking after her, in making sure that her needs were met, and who she thought had been treated poorly, overworked, underpaid, and mostly taken for granted. It was Alice, her second mother, and the feeling that she had let her down, that she had made promises to her in terms of seeing she got paid more and had not made good on them, which, more than anything else, had motivated Blair to join the workshop. A few weeks before my visit, Blair had been back in Chicago visiting her parents when her father suddenly announced, "You forgave us for killing Alice." Blair was stunned. All she could recall was that when Alice had died 5 years earlier, I think maybe at some point I accused them of working her to death. If she in fact did that, she said she had repressed it, mainly because she had never wanted to risk losing her father's love, and yet she felt they must have known how deeply her death affected me and how much I blamed them for her death. Whenever Blair or her siblings were in trouble, Alice sided with them. I didn't know it at the time, but whichever kid was in trouble with my parents, they had an ally to the end. Only later did I come to understand that it was her own identification as an underdog in our culture, which brought her back to one of the things she had learned in the workshop, that until there's full equality, everybody's black, echoing a prevailing sentiment of the civil rights struggle that if no, I changed this later because I had the quote wrong, that, just trying to remember. I'm going to have what I have because I'm not remembering right away what I had originally, echoing a prevailing sentiment of the civil rights struggle that if they're not free, we're not free, which is not quite accurate, similar to it, a code she was now trying to live by. Another thing she lived by was a belief in fate. And in that vein, she was convinced that growing up with Alice, coming to live in the most segregated city in the country, and finding her way to the Beyond Racism Project had all happened for a reason. Her belief in fate aside, the important thing was that she now felt strong enough to confront racism whenever and wherever it occurred, as she did the previous Thanksgiving when a relative made some comment about blacks at the dinner table, saying, "That's how they are." Blair challenged her, said that she shouldn't generalize that way, that it personally hurt her to hear that kind of remark. Needless to say, this didn't endear her to her relative, or to anyone else at the table for that matter, but she had made her point. Of all her memories of Alice, her most powerful ones were of the last week of Alice's life and of her funeral. Alice had just come back from the hospital to her one-room apartment on Chicago's South Side, happy that she was getting better, or seemed to be. As she always did when Blair came to visit, Alice stuck her head out the window and waved, wanting to make sure that Blair got to her car safely when it was time to leave. And that was my last memory of her. That beautiful, beautiful hand, that loving face watching me out, and then she died a week later, alone, just convulsed and died. At the funeral, a funeral Blair's parents organized, we saw for the first time so many people that loved Alice. We knew of her friends, of course, because she talked about them and they sometimes came to our house, but we didn't know how loved she was. Blair gave the eulogy, and then they all made the long drive to the cemetery, her fury with her father peaking as they got there, to a place that was horrible and desolate, unlike the cemeteries where her grandparents were buried, which were beautiful and close by. Her father had paid for the cheapest possible funeral, and she did confront him about it. Of that she had no doubt. To see her go in the ground in that area was so excruciating for Blair that what I've had to do is rebury her, in a sense, and realize that that doesn't matter at all. That her body went down there, but her spirit lifted up, and her spirit was certainly with me and with all of us. And so, as it happened, was her voice. Not long after the funeral, Blair came upon a journal that Alice had been keeping, a journal that contained the thoughts and emotions that Alice had not been able to express directly to the Moreland family. I wonder what white people think of colored people, or I should say what they think of me. I know, but I would like to know from the ones I'm working for. One thing I know is that they do not think that you need money. Just a little will do you, they think. As long as you work for them, they seem to think that's a big thing. They feels that you really doesn't know what to do with it anyway. Yet they spend money for things that they could do without, and really they would rather spend it foolish than give you a few dollars more. They will always say you are nice or good to the children, and that should be just fine. Well, it isn't. So you see, it's not fun working for nothing when you have bills too. Sometime they have to learn the hard way. The real truth is that they should say we should give her more money, but instead they will say, oh, if it hadn't been for Alice, we couldn't have done this or that. I can't spend that. In this whole world, there is only one Alice, and you better believe it too. Mrs. Moreland could not get another person like me. People that have us working for them just don't give a damn as long as they get what they want and their work done. What can you do? Stop working for them and let them feel the mistake of not giving you more money, which they will never feel? At least they won't admit it anyway. You can never sit and talk about little things with them because they are too busy, and what you have to say anyway is not important to them because you are dumb and you don't know what you were talking about in the first place. But if they want to talk to you, you listen. Thank you. All yours, as long as you want. Marge?
What surprised you the most? What was most unexpected? You must have gone into this with some preconceived ideas.
I wanted to think that I started this journey through what I later describe as the minefield of race, without stereotypes, without assumptions, that I started as I try to do any story I work on, thinking that if I know what the story is, I will never find the story. And I think for the most part I did, in that I didn't come to it with a particular axe to grind. I think I did come to it as, if for lack of a better term, a white liberal shaped by the 60s, but the journey became very complicated for me, and I found that I did have assumptions along the way that I needed to keep ridding myself of, stereotypes that I think I didn't have, but I needed to get rid of. I mentioned about locking the car door. I think that I expected to hear every black I spoke with blame whites for every bad thing that had happened to them. That was obviously a stereotype I had that I didn't realize I had until I started on the process. The one thing I did for a number of months, and I mentioned this early in the book, I quote a poem from Whitman, is that I understood very clearly that I could never know what it was like to be black in America. What I could do was day after day put myself in a situation where I was the only white face in a room to try to get some sense of what that felt like. And that's not something that I had necessarily known up to this point. But I found a lot of things that surprised me. I didn't, not long after I began this, at least the Milwaukee part of the story, after I'd been down south and realized I couldn't be down south to tell the story, when Clarence Thomas was nominated for the Supreme Court, I was in Milwaukee and went into so many different situations and situations which I was the only white person in the room, hearing blacks talk about the Thomas nomination. Well, just hearing that, you know, and we later saw that in the hearings, you know, if I had thought up to this point, if I had really bought into the stereotype that all blacks thought alike, I was quickly disabused of that in the discussions about Clarence Thomas. So this book was an education for me. This was a journey for me. I was interviewed yesterday by Bill Tatum of the Amsterdam News, and I was nervous about it ahead of time. And even before he sat down at the restaurant, he said, "You're crazy." And I said, "Is that in a bad way or a good way?" And he said, "No, in a good way." He said, to have spent that many years of your life, you know, thinking that you could change this a little bit. And I said, well, I thought that maybe it could change a little bit, you know, because I'd like to think that the book, race has been around a long time. It's very patient. It's not going anywhere. It's up to us for it to go somewhere. And I felt that if race can be patient, I can be patient. So my attitude was, this is going to take as long as it takes, and I will spend as much time with people as I need to until I really feel that they're really speaking honestly to me, not just telling me what I think they want me to hear on both sides. And people who know me well know I'm persistent enough to do that and can usually stay around for a few years before they want to throw me out. That I felt that that was the challenge, and yet at the same time, I didn't want to feel so burdened by the fact that I was talking to people about something that is the least favorite topic in America. I want to just talk to them as people who happened, two people or a group of people, and we just happened to be talking about race. Without saying, okay, we're going to talk about race and everybody now has to feel very tense. I tried to put them at ease about that and just be myself. You know, I felt that that was the most important thing I could do, and I felt that that in and of itself would sort of stand me in good stead.
I've noticed for a long time, my girlfriend's of another race, and but not black, and when we go into the neighborhood where I live, which is mostly Hispanic, I've noticed for a long time she actually locks her doors. And I come from a background where I grew up in the South, where where I went to school was 80% black, and I was white, and Jewish, where there weren't a lot of Jews. And then I moved north, where there were a lot of Jews, and everybody was white. And now I'm a teacher here, with where I teach in a school that's 90% Hispanic. And I'm wondering whether you see the problem as getting better or as getting worse. I haven't read your book, but I can assume from your title that you see there's work to be done, you know, a lot of work to be done. So.
Am I supposed to repeat the question? Is that? No, I thought I was. Just answer it. Okay. Well, the title has a double meaning. It's not meant to be a depressing title. It's meant to suggest we've made a lot of progress, but I think we still have a long way to go. We have a long way to go because a lot of whites are in denial about this topic of race, and unfortunately, there's such a misunderstanding of why the black middle class is still very angry, very isolated, and whites say, what more do they want? I mean, what more do blacks want? 64 Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, large black middle class. Why are they so angry? Because a lot of whites really don't understand the emotional costs that assimilation has had on blacks. Just because you're hired doesn't mean you're really totally accepted. And I have talked to many people. I mean, there's really two separate things here. The black middle class, in my mind, the black middle class and the people living in the inner cities, of which part of that group is the real underclass. So I'm thinking of two separate things here. You know, the workplace is an interesting place because you don't choose the people you're working around for the most part in large companies. It's an opportunity for whites and blacks. This is not just about whites. This is something else I learned along the way. And it's not just because I would hear in meeting after meeting in the black community, in churches and so forth, that self-responsibility, you know, that term I heard over and over and over again. It's not just that. There's a paralysis on both sides. I mean, one of the things that this white liberal found out is that blacks hold on to race sometimes when it's not race, when it's not about race. Sometimes it's about class. Or as Howard Fuller says in a class that he taught informally, he's one of the leading characters in the book, class on Saturday mornings, you know, he said, sometimes it's about the fact that you're a jerk. And, you know, if my daughter, who I saw last night, and I don't even know if Miata's here yet, or if she's coming, he said, if my daughter brings home a C from Marquette University, she cannot run the argument with me that she got that C because she's black. She's at Marquette University, she got a C, she got a C. So there is a lot of misunderstanding on both sides. There's work to be done on both sides within the white community, the black community, but there's a lot that has to be done to bridge the racial divide. And we have to stop looking past each other. We really have to talk to each other so that we can get to a point where a black person can say to a white person, or vice versa, in a conversation over a cheeseburger, you are a jerk, and have that be okay. I think, and now this is maybe something you can't say on the Upper West Side of New York, I really think that political correctness was the worst thing that we came up with, this smart country of ours, because I think it enables people to skirt around things, to not really talk honestly. I was on MSNBC the day the Gallup poll came out in June, and I was astonished by how dishonest people were. They were saying the right things, but it's not really what they believe. It's not really true that a large majority of whites would have no problem at all, if a large number of blacks moved into their neighborhood. That's just not true. It'd be nice if we could get to that point, but we're not at that point. And we have to be real about this. We are not at that point. So, I mean, that's what's tricky with these Gallup polls. You're on the phone, you're doing 50 things, you're saying what you think the pollster, but that's not helping us. So I don't know what's going to happen with the race initiative. I think it's disturbing that very little has been heard about it since Clinton announced it on June 14th in San Diego. I mean, I think the first town meeting's coming up to tie in with the integration of 40th anniversary of Central High in Little Rock. But I'm concerned about the initiative and what's going to come out of it. A lot of it is up to us. I mean, the government still has a role to play, but it really is up to us as individuals. Yeah.
In the policy area, given the rollback and affirmative action and the welfare bill and stuff like that, do you feel that to some extent we're actually moving backwards, at least within that arena? There's actually been some backwards movement.
Well, you're mentioning now two things. You're mentioning welfare reform, and you're mentioning affirmative action. Which do you want?
Both, because in my view, they're kind of both instances where there's some degree of rollback. In terms of government's sense of responsibility, I know a lot of people may disagree.
Well, you know, these are obviously two very difficult topics. In the case of affirmative action, I don't particularly think that the case that's before the court is a very good case to become a case that might be the pivotal case around affirmative action, because it has to do with a firing as opposed to a hiring. I think from what I read, you can tell that I still am, that I'm someone in favor of affirmative action. I don't think white America has yielded all that much, really. If my daughter, who is 4 years old, 14 years from now, wants to go to Princeton and winds up at Williams instead, I hope that she and I together will not feel that that's such a hardship. Because I hope that by the time she's 18 years old, she'll have the same attitude that I had, driven person that I am. I'm going to make it no matter what. So that's how I feel about affirmative action. I think we still need it. As far as welfare reform, everybody is rushing to proclaim this a success. You know, we've got to wait. We have to wait It's so complicated. It makes me nervous that the rolls are dropping. This is a success. It's going to take a lot more time before we know that.
To stay in the policy area, I know Milwaukee has been a leader in the school voucher thing, and I was wondering if you had a chance to witness any of the effects of that, and on racial racial.
Yeah, the question is about the school choice plan that State Representative Annette Polly Williams worked very hard during the 80s to have come about, and did come about in the fall of 1990, which was then embraced by the Bush administration, that allows public money to follow public school children to private schools. Very controversial. For a number of years, it couldn't be determined whether it was successful or not in terms of test scores. Some of these private schools, for a variety of other reasons, closed down, and then the kids were really left in limbo. It seems now that it has helped. There's been so much controversy about it, but the latest findings seem to be that the students who have entered into the school choice program in Milwaukee have been helped. Now, Howard Fuller, who was the superintendent for a number of years in the time frame of this book, even though he was the superintendent of MPS, Milwaukee Public Schools, he was for it. He was for anything that would help kids get an education. Charter schools, school choice. You know, I mean, the initial reaction, of course, from the NAACP and from a lot of people is, this is not a good idea to have public money going to private schools. But, you know, there are so many problems with public education that, you know, why not? Why not? Why not try it? One more, and then I'm going to get everybody.
On that briefly.
Yeah.
Was there competition among, I'm concerned particularly about how this affects the black community. Was there competition, a feeling of competition among blacks who were competing to have their children to get into a few slots, the few slots in the private and public
It wasn't
schools?
so much
Great resentment and antagonism among blacks?
The question was there a feeling of competition and resentment among different black parents trying to get into the school choice program? It wasn't as the doors were not being beaten down as much as you would think, but there was a feeling, there was a worry that the parents who were more involved, you know, would, you know, and were interested, would get their kids into the program, and the whole concern about school choice is that it would leave the public schools, you know, in an even worse situation. But we're not talking about a lot of slots in a school district of 100,000, and that these things have to be kept in context. Yeah.
This is a final question.
We out of time? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned a few times that you are a white liberal.
No. I was saying that.
What did you say? I heard it a couple of times.
Okay.
As a white liberal.
Okay.
White liberal.
Okay. I think that I began the book. It's a little deceptive. It is and it isn't. I think I began the book as an identifiably white liberal shaped by the 60s. My journey through the book, I think, is much more complicated than that. And I basically ask you in the book to embrace the gray areas, move beyond labels, move beyond liberal, conservative, that this is a human dilemma that we're dealing with here, and that if we can't move beyond polarization and labels, that's too easy.
That's my question.
Okay.
First question was, what is a white liberal in your frame of mind? Second, I'm not sure I got it or not. Are you still white? Or what are you now? Are you non-label? Are you conservative? Are you right-wing? Are you Christian? Whatever. What's your label?
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is okay. I mean, according to the New York Times last Sunday, I'm a Christian pilgrim of the inner city, even though I'm Jewish. I don't know. I'm uneasy with these labels. Well,
I don't use them. I always hear them on TV.
I'm using them as a jumping off point. I'm using them to say that I'm using them to say that I feel that the war on poverty in the Great Society has gotten an exceedingly and undeserved bad name across the board, when in point of fact, that if some of the things that happened in those programs that were in, some of them were bad programs, okay? But some of them, frankly, were not funded well enough. They weren't given enough of a chance to work. And I think Nick Lemon's book, The Promised Land, proved that. Should have proved that for all time. The mistake that this is another thing I learned in response to Marge's question. The mistake that white liberals made in the 60s, and I see this now having worked on this book, the mistake that white liberals made is in going down to the South, and instead of working with the people in the South to fight against segregation, they wanted to go down and still be in charge. Well, I think what we saw was we saw blacks fighting against that, and we also saw the rise of the Black Power movement. I didn't completely understand all of that until I started working on this book, and understanding that I understand what Jim Sleeper talks about when he talks about liberal racism, because nobody wants to feel beholden to anybody else. So in the sense of, white liberals have not done all good, conservatives don't do all bad. I'm saying I was a white liberal in that I think I was somebody completely sympathetic to the movement, to the policies of the 60s, even though there were some bad policies. And I found, as I undertook this journey through this decade, when it's much more complicated than it was in the 60s, what the civil rights movement about was very simple. Could everybody drink from one water fountain? What race is about in the 90s is far more complex. And basically the book asks you, don't be afraid of the complexity, embrace the complexity, not only of the issues, but of people. Sean.
In your interviews with people who were adults, did you get any sense of how they talked to young people who they were around, how they talked to young people about race? Can you convey what you heard or what you saw even with regard to some sort of intergenerational dialogue going on? Was there any, and what was it like if you saw it?
Okay. I found in Montgomery, when I first started on this journey, that I was mostly interviewing blacks in Montgomery at first, and I found that their children knew very little. They said, my children know nothing about the 50s. They know nothing about segregation. They know nothing about Jim Crow. It wasn't just because they weren't learning about it in school. Their parents weren't talking to them about it. And I said, why? We're ashamed to talk to them about it. And I said, but if they live without history, without context, I said, and I was sort of suggesting them that they weren't entirely doing their job as parents, because you can't leave it up to the schools to do it. That was a real interesting lesson I got early on, because they didn't want their children to know, let alone whether they said, first of all, they said, but my kid wouldn't believe that I had to, but then you find out that they wouldn't even tell them that that was the case. That seemed to me irresponsible on that side. What I found among white adults, and this is something we need to break through, is that whole socialization process. There's that point, and I don't think there's a formula for it,